Welcome again to our study of names that we should know from the Bible. Today is kind of a collective process of names because we're going to look at the book of Judges and those people who were described as redeemers of Israel, the judges. And the book of Judges records the time following the death of Joshua and before the emergence of the prophets who dominated the message of God to Israel from that period of time on until almost the time of Jesus' birth. There's a verse that describes this in Judges 21:25. It was a time of relativism in Israel's history. It says, "There was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes." You don't have to push that verse very far to recognize that each individual deciding what he wants and what he believes and what he thinks and making that the law of his life helps to create a chaos, because we are then living in a selfish, unmetered world without authority. So it was with these people after Joshua died. They began to think, well, I have my parcel of the Holy Land. This tribe over here has its parcel. They can do what they want to do. We can do what we want to do. I can do what I want to do. And so they began to live this self-dominated period of time in the life of Israel. What happened during that time was that God chose to raise up judges, not dignified men in black robes, but warriors who would help the nation to move out of the perilous situations they were living in. And each time Israel sinned, God allowed one of their neighboring nations to come in, dominate them, create a new slavery period in their lives, and wait for the people of Israel to cry out in supplication for salvation from God. So you can remember that these judges dealt with four elements: sin, that is disobeying God; the servitude, which is God allowing them to fall into bondage; supplication, which is crying out to God for freedom; and finally salvation, where God raises up a judge and asks him or her to lead the nation back to spiritual life. That stands against the biblical call, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." The moment the people started turning away from God's plan to produce holiness in their lives, something happened that made life very difficult. You and I can see that in our society today, particularly in this time of hate. There are people and groups who hate each other. There are those who want to destroy this group or that group, or this point of view or that point of view. That kind of relativism produces a political chaos in any nation. So it was with the people of Israel. Now we're going to make a cursory study of some of the judges, but not all 13 of the judges who lead in this book. Israel continued to fail to tear down the heathen altars in Canaan. And as they continued to move into the land without destroying those idols, God was not pleased with them. They began to compromise. They began to marry the people who existed in Canaan who should have been destroyed, and instead they wound up with intermarriage and then eventually worshiping the idols of the people who lived there before. The first judge that we see in the book of Judges was a man named Othniel. Not much is told us about him, but for 40 years he provided redeeming leadership in the period of time when he was a judge. The second judge is a little more dramatic in his reign over Israel. He's identified as left-handed, and he killed the king Eglon, who was an enormously obese man. If you want to read that story, go to the book of Judges chapter 3 and read verses 12 through 30. The Bible is a very plain book, and it's kind of a gory story, but it's one in which Ehud, the judge, destroys Eglon, and the nation is again restored to a time of peace and blessing. Shamgar is listed as the third judge in the book, but only for a brief time. And then we're introduced to a team. Barak, who was supposed to be the lead judge, and Deborah, the woman who advised him, who protected him, and behind whose skirts he hid. Barak, or Barak, as some may pronounce his name, had a power behind the throne. Her name was Deborah, and she personally killed General Sisera and sang a victory duet with Barak for the entire nation. Don't ever underestimate the power of a woman. In our country, it took a long time for women to stand on an equal footing as far as voting was concerned. But in this case, you had a woman who had such character, who had such determination, who had such courage that Barak even stood behind her and allowed her to give leadership to the nation during this period of time. And then we're introduced in the book of Judges to a man named Gideon. And I think he's probably a little more familiar than some of the other judges. Like Moses, he underestimated his own strength, and he hesitated at the call of God in his life. The angel of the Lord, which many scholars would describe as being an epiphany, that is, a presence of Jesus prior to his birth at Bethlehem. And this angel demonstrated the power of God for Gideon. Gideon knew that he should bring a sacrifice, so he brought a lamb and he brought broth. And the angel of the Lord said, "Put it on the rock." And Gideon did. And immediately the fire consumed the sacrifice that Gideon had brought. That should have been enough to demonstrate to Gideon that this angel of the Lord was calling him and would empower him to lead the nation. But like us, Gideon said, "Well, I'm not quite sure, God. Can you show me another assurance that you're calling me?" And that's where we get the familiar story of the fleece. The first night, Gideon said, "Okay, God, if you're calling me, let the fleece be wet and the ground be dry." So when he woke up in the morning and everything else around it was dry, he picked up the fleece and he wrung it out and got almost a gallon of water. But that wasn't enough for Gideon. The next night he said, "Lord, let the ground be wet and let the fleece be dry." And so the next morning when he got up and he picked it up, the fleece was dry and the ground was wet. And Gideon finally succumbed to doing the will of God in his life. When that happened, the people around Gideon saw what God was doing, and they called him by a new name, Jerubbaal. And that's when he destroyed the statue of Baal. And when the people came after him to kill him, he said, "Let your God take care of its own problems." And they backed away. Well, God demonstrated to Gideon that he was the power that was going to change things for the nation. And so when Gideon amassed a large number of soldiers to fight, God said, "That's too many." And finally, with only 300, the battle was accomplished. And don't forget that that's the way God works in your life and mine. He never wants to share his glory with anyone else, but instead, he takes a little thing and makes a great power for us and uses it in our lives. You may be in a situation where you think, "I can't do anything, I'm too small." But God says, "I will win the battle. It's up to me, so trust me." And that was a lesson that finally Gideon had to learn. Among the other notable judges in the book was a man named Jephthah. He reminds us that sometimes it's foolish to promise things that you can't do, or maybe that you shouldn't do. He made a vow in the battle that he would sacrifice the first thing that he saw coming home from the battle. You can almost guess what the story is. The first thing that he saw was his little daughter running out to greet him, and his heart was stricken, and he found himself despondent, depressed, discouraged because of his own wicked vow, without thinking to the Lord, "What should I vow in order to thank you for what you've done in this battle?" It's a tragic story, but it illustrates for you and for me that sometimes we think we're doing a good thing when we pledge something. I remember in a church that I served some years ago, there was a man who said, "I'm going to give X amount of dollars to the building fund." And everybody was happy with the pledge. It was a large one. But he said a little bit later on, "I'm waiting for God to give me the winnings in the lottery." Well, it was a pledge that he couldn't possibly fulfill, and it was foolish for him to depend on the lottery rather than to depend on God. Jephthah was like that. He overreached what he could do, and God called him to stand up and answer for his rash vow. You will find the story recorded in the 11th chapter of the book of Judges, especially verses 30 and 31. Now, Jephthah was a good man. He was a man of faith. He's mentioned in the Hall of Faith description in Hebrews 11. That's not an insignificant list of people who followed God. The final judge we want to mention and talk about for a little bit in the book of Judges is a man named Samson. And I think you probably all have heard of Samson. He was a man of great strength. He took a Nazirite vow very early in his life after his birth, and he began to grow up. And his powerful events are recorded in the book of Judges, chapter 13 and following. His father Manoah and his wife listened to the angel of the Lord. Again, that phrase comes up as it did with Gideon. And they experienced what Jacob experienced at Penuel. They experienced being close to God and still living, and they rejoiced in that. So they named Samson, their young son, this man to follow God, and he became the judge. His great strength was a marvel to the people. But he was finally subdued by the pleas of his lover, Delilah. And when he finally told her, "This is the source of my strength. My hair has never been cut," and other items that were a part of the Nazirite vow, and she had him shorn, and when she did, the Philistines came in, got him, put out his eyes, and he lived a miserable life until the end. It's interesting, from the time Samson did these wonderful things until he met Delilah, the Bible simply records a statement. He judged Israel 20 years. But the rest of his life, when he is doing nothing, everything has passed by, but he brings down this tremendous portico by pushing against the two columns and killing more Philistines in his death than his life. At the end of the next chapter, it simply says, Samson judged Israel 20 years. That says to me that sometimes we serve God faithfully for a period of time, but then there comes a time when we depart, when we backslide, when we turn aside from following God. The only years that count are those that are when we were faithful to our call to follow God and to do what he had called us to do. That was the way with Samson. Nothing was added to his wonderful accomplishment for 20 years after he met Delilah. It was all over. Samson judged Israel 20 years. Well, let me look at 5 simple lessons that we can take looking at these characters in the book of Judges. They are the ones that characterize God's intervention in their lives. And here's one of them. When God demands purity in our lives, we can't afford to compromise and live below his standard of righteousness. God never altered what he told the people through the book of Judges as he had from the Exodus forward. Be ye holy, for I am holy. When you and I fail to live up to God's standard, servitude of some kind, disappointment, those kinds of things are going to happen in our lives as they did in the nation of Israel. The second lesson we can learn is that the dramatic adventures of the judges are really beyond Hollywood's imagination. I told you about Ehud, about the duet that Deborah and Barak sung to the nation. These stories fascinate us because they illustrate God's amazing power in our lives, things that not even Hollywood or its writers could imagine, and stories that they could not tell us. The third lesson I want to mention is that God is patient in giving our life's calling to us. Gideon's fleece is a good example of that. We wrestle with God sometimes and say, wait a minute, God, I don't want to do it that way. And God says, do it my way. God is always willing to bless you and to test you until you do his will, until you follow his plan for your life. That is the story of Gideon and what he illustrates for us. The fourth lesson is we must be careful to avoid making vows that we cannot keep, even spiritual vows. We need to be careful that we don't brag about something we really can't do, because God may hold us to those kinds of vows, as the story of Jephthah illustrates. And finally, when God calls us, we cannot be gotten off track with the distractions of life. Samson is a good example of that. He followed God's way, and when he did, he was a strong, overcoming leader for the nation of Israel. But when he followed the temptation of Delilah, he lost his power, and he failed to do what God had called him to do and how God had blessed him for the nation. Don't forget, you can't take God's call for granted. Allow him to lead you. Allow him to bless you. And allow him to honor his call in a way that will breed success and reward in your life. Let it happen for you as the scriptures describe it for these leaders. God bless you today.